On a July morning in 2016, 45-year-old Nick Mrballen sped down a desert road in Mrballen, Arizona, just outside of Tucson. Nick saw the mountains in the distance as he drove past several large airplane hangars and a massive 7,000-foot runway. Then Nick slowed down, turned off the road near a white concrete office building, and pulled into the parking lot of Mrballen Aerospace Solutions. Mrballen Aerospace Solutions was a company that handled aircraft maintenance for major commercial airlines and aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus. And Nick was the company's director of maintenance, a job that came with a ton of responsibility and a whole bunch of people that worked underneath him. Nick stepped out of his car. He was tall with brown eyes, he had a short military-style haircut, and a goatee that was just starting to turn gray. He walked through the parking lot toward the office building, and it felt like most July mornings in that part of Arizona. It was already 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and Nick knew that even by midday, it would be at least 10 degrees hotter. But Nick didn't mind the heat. Before getting into the aerospace industry, he had been a decorated United States Marine and had served in Kuwait, a very hot place in the Middle East, during the First Gulf War. After that experience, working on airplanes in the Arizona desert felt comfortable by comparison. Nick stepped inside the building, and right away he felt the cold blast from the air conditioner. He said good morning to a few coworkers, and then he walked to his office, sat down, checked his email, and began going over his schedule for the day. Nick wanted to head outside to one of the airplane hangars so he could check on the progress of a particular job, but his office phone rang. And so Nick answered, and he heard the director of human resources on the other line. And the HR director asked if Nick wouldn't mind coming to his office so they could chat. Nick hung up, and he felt really annoyed. He didn't know what the director wanted, but he knew from experience that getting called into HR was rarely a good thing. Nick walked out and headed down a long hallway to the HR director's office. The door was already open, and the director waved Nick inside. Nick closed the door behind him and took a seat. The HR director was a nice guy, and he and Nick got along fine, but Nick really just wanted this meeting to end quickly, so he asked point blank, "What's going on?" And the HR director said, one of Nick's employees had recently filed a complaint against him. Now, Nick knew the HR director was not going to tell him who actually filed this complaint, but Nick wanted to know what the complaint actually was. And the director told him that the employee basically complained that Nick was way too hard on his team all the time. Nick shook his head. Complaints like that made no sense to him. If somebody was not doing their job the right way, Nick just told them. He wasn't trying to be mean, he was just trying to be efficient. A lot of his team members figured that Nick's straightforward and often harsh management style just stemmed from his military background. But that actually was not the reason. Nick knew working on aircrafts affected the lives and safety of other people, and so he saw no room for error. So if somebody did their job poorly, he had to make sure they knew about it. The HR director understood where Nick was coming from, and he wasn't planning on taking any immediate action against Nick or anything. He just wanted Nick to know what was going on. Nick left the office and walked outside into the hot Arizona sun. As he paced around for a second, he thought about the HR complaint more and more, and the more he thought about it, the more annoyed he got, because he was actually pretty sure he knew who made the complaint. James LePan, a safety inspector on Nick's team, had recently clashed with Nick at work. Nick had caught James parking in a restricted area, and he let him have it. Then Nick saw James spending time on his personal tablet during work hours, and again, he let him have it. While Nick felt like what he did was justified, he knew there was a pretty good chance James did not feel the same way. Eventually, Nick began walking towards an airplane hangar that was off in the distance. He could have driven over, but he figured, walking would help him clear his head. As he walked, Nick couldn't help but think about maybe confronting James about this whole complaint, but he knew, that would be a mistake. He didn't even know for sure if James really was the guy who made the complaint. And Nick knew he really could not afford to keep drawing the attention of HR. Nick had had run-ins with the HR department before, but those run-ins had nothing to do with his actual work. Nick had been described by many as a ladies' man, and he had lived up to that description during his time at Mrballen Aerospace. He had dated at least 3 women he had worked with, and there was a pretty good chance there were more women at work, but Nick wouldn't admit to them. And 2 of those 3 relationships that he admitted to ended really badly. Over a year earlier, Nick had been dating a colleague, a woman named Jessica, and she had started spending a lot of her time at Nick's house. But one evening, she had caught Nick in bed with another woman they worked with named Claudia. Jessica was furious and she lashed out at Nick, and Nick basically told her, okay, fine, the relationship's over and you need to leave. And so soon after that, Jessica left and Claudia began spending most of her time at Nick's place. But that relationship also fell apart when Nick started seeing yet another colleague named Christina. And when Nick and Christina had recently gotten engaged, it did not go over well with his ex-girlfriends. And so the whole thing had played out like a soap opera at work, and even though the company did not have a policy against office relationships, Nick's actions and his ex-girlfriend's anger had previously landed him in the HR director's office. Nick walked into the airplane hangar and saw members of his team hard at work. The sights and sounds of the hangar immediately put Nick at ease, and he pushed aside any thoughts about his personal affairs. Even employees who didn't necessarily love the way Nick managed them knew Nick took his job really seriously and he worked harder than anyone. So Nick spent the rest of the day checking in on different maintenance projects and stepping in to help whenever his team needed him. By the time he was heading home that evening, the sun was starting to set and it was painting the desert orange and pink. And something happened on the drive home, like it did most nights when Nick left work. He suddenly changed into this totally different person. The hard-nosed, confrontational boss suddenly became a soft-spoken guy who loved his dog and tending to plants in his garden. Nick drove down the street of his secluded suburban neighborhood and pulled into the garage of his 2-story house. He walked inside and heard his beloved pit bull terrier, Smokey, barking and running to greet him. Nick crouched down and pet Smokey and talked to the dog like he was a baby. Then he told Smokey it was time to go for a walk, and the dog got even more excited. Nick and Smokey headed outside just as the last rays of the sun disappeared for the night. After he and Smokey had been walking for a while, Nick felt his phone vibrate inside of his pocket. He grabbed it and looked at a text message and smiled. Then he told Smokey they needed to pick up the pace because Nick's fiancée, Christina, was heading over to the house and he couldn't wait to see her. On July 17, 2016, so about a week after Nick dealt with that HR complaint, he spent a lazy Sunday with his fiancée, Christina, at her house. Nick had been married twice, and after his second divorce, he had sworn to his friends and family that he would never get married again. But soon after Nick and Christina had met at work, Nick began to change his mind. He thought Christina was beautiful and that she was one of the most positive, considerate people he had ever met. Christina knew about Nick's past with other women at work, but after spending time with him, she stopped worrying about it. She loved Nick and wanted to be with him. So when Nick had asked her to marry him, she immediately said yes. And so that Sunday, Nick and Christina laid around Christina's house and discussed potential wedding venues and other wedding details. But then Nick brought up the recent HR complaint. For some reason, even a week later now, it was still bothering him. Christina knew Nick well enough that she knew he was not about to change his management style. She just wished his employees could see that Nick actually was very different than the persona they saw at work. At home, he was a funny, caring, loving guy. It was just the way he had to be at work. That's why he acted that way. Ultimately, Christina told Nick, "Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. It's just work stuff. It'll go away. Don't stress." The couple chatted for a bit longer. Then around 6 p.m., Nick got up and he gave Christina a kiss, and then he headed back to his house. Christina had some things to deal with at her own place, so she was going to stay there for the night. Once Nick got home, he took Smokey out for a walk and then relaxed and watched some TV. Later that night, he called Christina and they talked some more. On nights they didn't stay together, they always made sure to talk on the phone before bed, and then they would always text each other first thing in the morning. Nick told Christina he loved her and then said goodnight. He went upstairs to his bedroom and Smokey followed. Nick took off all his clothes, he often slept naked when it was this hot out, and he climbed into bed. Smokey leapt up onto the bed too and curled up by Nick's feet, and pretty soon they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, at around 4 a.m., so the next morning, Smokey suddenly woke up when he heard a sound coming from outside the window on the roof. A few hours later, at around 8:30 a.m., Christina listened to Nick's voicemail for the third or fourth time, and she had no idea what was going on. Nick woke up early every day, and he usually headed out to work by 6 a.m. So when Christina didn't stay with Nick, she always woke up to a good morning text from him. But Nick did not text her that morning, and he wasn't answering his phone. And when she had called into work, someone in Nick's department said he hadn't shown up yet. Nick never overslept, so Christina worried that maybe he had gotten sick the night before and wasn't feeling well enough to get out of bed. Christina hung up her phone, slipped it in her purse, and walked out to her car. She drove right over to Nick's house. A few minutes after 9 a.m., Christina parked her car right out front of Nick's, and as soon as she got out, she instantly knew something was wrong. She could hear Smokey barking loudly from the backyard. Smokey always slept in the bed, and that included the nights when Christina stayed over. And even if Nick had let Smokey outside that morning, he would never have left the dog by himself barking like that. Christina rushed up to the front door and used the house key Nick had given her to open up the door. She walked inside, and what she saw totally confused her. There were all these cleaning products just laying out on the living room floor, like someone had just literally dropped them and then run away. She called out to Nick, but got no response, so she walked upstairs and headed down the hallway towards his bedroom. When she got to the bedroom, she found the door was cracked open. From the hallway, Christina again yelled for Nick, but again, there was no answer. So, after taking a deep breath, Christina pushed the bedroom door open and walked inside, and immediately she began crying and shaking her head. Nick was laying still on his bed, totally naked and covered in blood. Christina grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice cracked, and she couldn't hold back the tears. She told the dispatcher she believed her fiancé had been shot. Later that morning, Detective Jennifer Garcia of the Pima County Sheriff's Department parked her car a few houses down from Nick's. She could see the crime scene tape that was stretched across Nick's property, and she saw a couple of officers standing with a woman who was hunched over, crying and petting a pit bull. Detective Garcia had butterflies in her stomach. She'd only been a homicide detective for 7 months, and this was the first case she was actually taking the lead on. But Garcia had been preparing for this moment since she was a little girl, really since the first time she saw her grandfather in his police uniform. She had known, even back then, that she also wanted to be a cop when she grew up. And it just so happened that Garcia grew up to be really smart, and she had a keen eye for evidence. So, at a relatively young age, she had already proven to be a very skilled detective. But Garcia knew leading an investigation was a different thing altogether. Still, she believed she was ready. So she took a deep breath, stepped out of her car, and began walking towards Nick's house. Detective Garcia spoke briefly with a few of the officers who had first arrived at the scene. They told her the woman who had found the body, Christina, had identified the victim as her fiancé, Nick Mrballen. Christina had told the officers about where Nick worked and what his job was, and she also told them that he was a former United States Marine. Garcia thanked the officers, then put on her gloves and headed inside the house. Then she, along with several forensics analysts, started to make their way through the house. And a few things immediately stood out to Garcia. She saw the cleaning products on the living room floor, then she found that the cabinet under the kitchen sink where the cleaning products had most likely been stored was left open. Now, she hadn't even seen the victim yet, but it looked to her like somebody had tried to clean up evidence they left behind, but had abandoned the job. Garcia headed upstairs and into the bedroom, and she saw a ballistics expert cataloging evidence. The ballistics expert told Garcia he had found multiple bullet casings from a .45 caliber handgun. And these casings had a distinct manufacturer's mark on them. There were 5 stars on the head of the casing. Then Garcia walked over to the bed and got a good look at Nick's body. Blood spatter covered the sheets and parts of the wall behind him. But Garcia also noticed some spots of blood that were all over the carpet by the window. And she noticed there was a big square of the carpet that had been cut out, like someone had removed a portion of the carpet. She also noticed a small pile of shattered glass, and so it looked like the window had been broken and then opened. Garcia was pretty sure the window is where the killer had entered the house, but since Nick's bedroom was up on the 2nd floor and not the 1st floor, she needed to figure out how the killer would have gotten access to the 2nd floor window. Garcia stepped away from the window and walked into the bathroom that connected to the bedroom. She saw more blood spots on the floor, but that really was not the thing that caught her attention. The thing that caught her attention was the bathroom floor had the distinct smell of mouthwash all over it. Garcia thought that was really weird, and she wondered if maybe it was somehow connected to all the cleaning products downstairs, like somebody had tried to disinfect the bathroom floor using this mouthwash. Garcia let the ballistics and forensics team continue their work inside, and she headed downstairs and out to the backyard. And once she was in the backyard, she turned and looked up, and she could see Nick's bedroom window up on the 2nd floor, and she could also see there was a ladder lying on the ground right below it. And so Garcia walked over and picked the ladder up and placed it up against the side of the house. And with this ladder, she was able to climb up and actually get on this small roof that basically sat at the first floor level and kind of wrapped around the small backyard patio, almost like an awning. And she could stand on that awning and actually could see directly in to Nick's bedroom. And there was actually enough space on this little roof that if you wanted to, you could walk over and actually climb into Nick's bedroom window. Garcia climbed back down the ladder, and she already had a pretty good idea about how Nick's killer actually carried out their attack. Not long after Garcia had gotten down from the roof, an officer walked into the backyard and told her that the forensics team had just found something in the garage that she needed to see. So Garcia walked back through the house and then into the garage, and there she found a forensics analyst who was crouched over a bucket. And so she joined him, and she noticed the bucket was filled with water. The analyst pointed to several small threads that were floating in this water, and the analyst told Garcia that these were carpet fibers, and he was almost positive they matched the fibers from the carpet inside the house. And so this discovery helped Garcia make sense of all the cleaning products in the living room and also what she'd seen upstairs. Garcia thought the killer had probably spilled their own blood and tried to clean the carpet and even cut out a piece of it to get rid of that evidence, but they had failed. So Garcia hoped the forensics team would find enough DNA samples to point her right to the murderer. After completing their first sweep of the house, Detective Garcia and members of her team met with Nick's fiancée, Christina, and a few of the neighbors. Garcia got a little more information about Nick's job from Christina, and Christina made it clear that some of the people who worked for Nick were not that fond of him. So Garcia told one of her team members to call Mrballen Aerospace to see if anybody in particular had a serious grudge against Nick. Then, when Garcia and other investigators spoke to the neighbors, they would say they had not heard anything out of the ordinary the night before or early that morning. That seemed totally weird to Garcia. The houses on Nick's block were pretty close together, and multiple gunshots had to have been fired. I mean, Nick's body was riddled with bullet holes, and based on the broken window and the view of Nick's bed from the roof, Garcia believed at least one of those shots had been fired from outside on the roof into Nick's bedroom. So how did no neighbor hear a gunshot? Garcia knew there was a potential obvious answer to this question. The killer could have been using a suppressor, or a silencer as many people call it, on his gun, which would have limited the sound coming out of the gun when it was fired, basically making it silent. And this immediately gave Garcia another idea. Some new handgun users find it much more difficult to fire accurately when using a suppressor because the suppressor adds weight and length to the barrel of the gun, and it can affect your aim. And this can be an even bigger issue when you're talking about making a long-distance shot. It's just really hard to do it with a suppressor unless you're experienced. So Detective Garcia thought there was a good chance that their shooter was someone who had real firearms training in their background. Garcia went back inside to walk through the house again when she got a call from Mrballen Aerospace's Human Resources Director. He had heard about what happened to Nick, and he had heard that police had reached out to his company to see if anybody had it out for Nick. And he would tell Garcia that another employee at the company, James Lapon, had recently filed a complaint against Nick. And the HR director had also noticed something strange. James had shown up to work that day wearing a bandage on his arm. Detective Garcia knew the killer had left a trail of blood throughout Nick's room, and maybe that blood was coming from a cut on their arm they got when they climbed in through that broken window. So, after talking to the HR director, Garcia quickly made her way to Mrballen Aerospace to speak with James and see what was going on with him and Nick. When she got there, an employee led Garcia to one of the airplane hangars where James was working, and right away Garcia noticed that James still had the bandage on his arm. Garcia walked over, introduced herself, and told him that she needed to ask him a few questions, and James said he was happy to answer them. James was 35 years old with brown hair and brown eyes, and he towered over Garcia. He was at least 6'3" tall, and he was very physically imposing. But Garcia didn't let that affect her. She asked him why he had filed an HR complaint against Nick, and James, he shook his head and he said he hadn't wanted this to turn into such a big deal. He just felt like Nick had crossed the line a couple of times as a manager with just the way he was treating people, and since Nick was not the easiest guy to talk to, James had gone directly to HR. Garcia nodded and then asked James about the bandage on his arm. James would say he got a pretty bad cut on his arm about a week earlier on the job, and he said there were guys he was working with that could vouch for him, and he said he had reopened the cut while doing some work on his house this past weekend, hence the bandage. Garcia said she would check in with his coworkers. Then she told James she had a few more questions. Did he have firearms training? And where had he been the day before and early that morning? James didn't hide anything. He said he did own several guns and he enjoyed going to the gun range and going hunting, and so he did take serious firearms training just so he could be a safe, responsible gun owner. This all made sense to Garcia. Hunting and shooting were very common pastimes in this area. Then James told Garcia that he was at home all day Sunday with his wife and kids. He and his wife had gone to bed together that night, and then he woke up Monday morning and went right to work. Then James peered down at Garcia, and he told her, look, I never liked Nick. I'm not going to pretend I like Nick, but I would never have done anything to hurt the guy. Garcia thanked James for taking the time to talk to her, and then she walked out of the hangar. And it wouldn't take her long to walk around the company and find several people who had witnessed James get hurt on the job. So that could possibly explain the bandage on his arm. But after making the rounds at Mrballen Aerospace, Garcia quickly realized that a disgruntled employee like James might not be the most likely suspect, because she heard that Nick had made at least a couple of women he worked with really, really mad. And this had to do with romantic relationships, which historically absolutely lead to murder and conflict and violence. So Garcia headed back to the sheriff's station to set up a series of interviews. That evening, Garcia met with James's wife. She was an Army vet who prided herself on being straightforward, and she told Garcia basically the same story her husband had, that they had spent Sunday with their kids and then they had gone to bed. And she would tell Garcia that, she knew her husband had not been a fan of Nick, but from her perspective, it just seemed like this was the usual way people got fed up with their bosses. It was nothing more than that. Detective Garcia thanked her for coming in. It was too early to cross anyone off the list of potential suspects, but James's wife had not given Garcia any reason to doubt that she was telling the truth. So now, Garcia turned her focus from Nick's work life to his romantic life. On July 19th, a day after Nick's body was discovered, Garcia sat across the table inside of a cramped interrogation room from one of Nick's ex-girlfriends, Claudia Banks. Claudia got really animated when she spoke, and she seemed very ready and willing to talk a lot. But what Claudia had to say was really not what Garcia had expected. Garcia assumed she was in for an angry rant over a jilted lover. But instead, Claudia told the detective that Nick had been really awesome. She said he was a great listener and a lot of fun to hang out with. Garcia sat there for a second feeling stunned. From what she'd heard back at Mrballen Aerospace, Nick's exes had been really mad at him, and some had even complained to HR about him. Claudia said she did not fit that description at all. She said she was totally happy for Nick when he got engaged, and now she was devastated that he was gone. Then Claudia got a very angry, serious look on her face, and she told Garcia there were two people police really needed to speak to: Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica Stillwell, and her own ex-boyfriend, Justin Skinner. Garcia leaned forward in her chair. She had not heard Justin's name before. But Claudia said that, when she and Nick were together, their relationship had actually come after they had broken two other people's hearts. Remember, Nick had kicked Jessica out of his house after she caught him cheating on her, and Claudia was pretty sure Jessica had never forgiven Nick for that. And Claudia dumped her boyfriend at the time, Justin, to be with Nick. But according to Claudia, this was not even the most significant part of the story. Claudia said on Sunday, the night before Nick's body was found, she had been hanging out with her mother at a bar when out of nowhere, her old ex, Justin, walked in. Claudia said she had done her best to avoid Justin after they had broken up because he had gone full-blown stalker mode, hanging out outside of her work, following Nick in his car, and stuff like that. And at the bar that Sunday, Justin had tried to talk to Claudia, but she wasn't having it, so she and her mother left. But then, just that morning, only a day after somebody murdered Nick, Claudia found a note on her front door. And the note was from Justin saying how sorry he was about Nick's death and that if Claudia needed someone to talk to, he was there for her. Detective Garcia stared across the table at Claudia. This story sounded too on the nose to be real. The stalker ex-boyfriend who hated Nick for, stealing his girl just happened to show up where she was the night before the murder, and then he had a note for her the day after Nick turned up dead? Garcia thanked Claudia and told her she could go now. The detective still wanted to talk to Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica, but now it seemed like Justin was the highest on her suspect list. The following day, Detective Garcia drove to Justin's house to meet with him. The temperature had hit 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and Garcia could feel herself starting to sweat just during the short walk from her car to his front door. She knocked on the door, and Justin let her inside. Garcia followed him into the kitchen, subtly looking around his house while she walked. Nothing really stood out about the house. It looked like a lot of the places she had seen that belonged to other single guys, a little cluttered and not much decoration. But something about Justin caught Garcia's attention right away. He had several long scratches on both of his arms. Garcia sat down with Justin at the kitchen table, and she got right to the point. She asked him if he still blamed Nick for breaking up his relationship with Claudia. Justin said he was not mad anymore about Nick and Claudia, and that he had let it all go, but when he was telling Garcia this, he didn't look up at her, he didn't make eye contact, and so she was pretty sure he didn't fully mean what he was saying, that maybe he was still mad. So Garcia said in response, if he had let things go, why had he shown up at the bar where Claudia had been on Sunday night, and why did he leave her a note just a day after Nick had been found dead? Justin's voice got real quiet, and he almost immediately began to backtrack what he had just said. He told Garcia that actually he did want to get back together with Claudia. He missed her. But he made it very clear he had nothing to do with Nick's murder. Garcia stayed on him and asked him about the cuts on his arms. Justin looked down at his arms and he kind of laughed, and he said he was a landscaper, so he always had little cuts all over his arms and hands. It was just part of his work. He didn't even think about them anymore. Garcia looked across the table at Justin. She couldn't quite get a read on him. Was he a broken-hearted guy who was just awkward and overbearing in trying to get his girlfriend back? Or was he jealous and angry enough to go kill a man to try to get his girlfriend back? So Garcia asked Justin if he would provide police with a DNA sample. She said it would be quick and easy, she would just swab his cheek. But Justin shook his head and said, no, I don't want to do that. Garcia smiled and told him she totally understood. Something like this could feel very invasive. Then Garcia stood up, and for a second, it must have seemed to Justin like she was about to leave, but she stopped and turned around and leaned in towards Justin, and with a smile on her face, she told him the best way to clear his name and to make sure everybody knew he did have nothing to do with Nick's death was to provide a DNA sample right here, right now. Justin looked up at Garcia, and with a very determined look on his face like he was about to do something big, he told Garcia, okay, I will provide a DNA sample. A little while later, Garcia headed back to the station with Justin's DNA sample for testing. The results would take some time to get back, so she prepared to interview another potential suspect, Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica Stillwell. Later that day, Garcia met with Jessica in the same interview room where she'd met with Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Claudia. But from the moment Jessica sat down, Garcia could tell this interview was going to be very different from her interview with Claudia. Jessica looked angry, and unlike Claudia, she did not think Nick had been really awesome. She said Nick had cheated on her in full view of her, and then totally broken her heart by basically kicking her out of the house and not caring at all about her. But she said that was not the only reason she had been so upset. Jessica also had a daughter, and when things fell apart with Nick, her daughter had been spending a ton of time at his house too, and so she was really sad. She missed Nick, and so the whole thing had just screwed up this little girl's life. Garcia listened and nodded along as Jessica spoke, like she was a friend who Jessica could confide in. And as she did this, it struck Garcia that if Jessica was involved in Nick's murder, she really was not trying to hide it. This was a woman who obviously carried a very serious grudge against Nick. Finally, after several minutes of ranting and raving, Jessica stopped talking. So Garcia asked her where she'd been on Sunday and then Monday morning, the time period when Nick was killed. Jessica said that she and her daughter had stayed at her mother's house the entire weekend, and then she woke up and drove to work from there on Monday. Garcia asked if Jessica would mind handing over her phone for a little while before she left. Garcia explained that police could download information and text messages from her phone, and that would be the easiest way for them to confirm Jessica's alibi. They would be able to tell if she really had been at her mother's house. Jessica had no hesitation. She reached into her pocket and put her phone on the table and told Garcia the police could do whatever they needed. She was telling the truth, and so she had nothing to hide. Garcia thanked her and then left the room with the phone. And at this point, police conducted a forensics download on the phone that would provide them with cell phone location data. But it would also give investigators a look at who Jessica had been texting with and what she had been saying in those messages. On July 21st, 2016, so 3 days after Nick's body had been found, Detective Garcia sat working at her desk. She had a handful of legitimate suspects, and she was still waiting on 2 pieces of evidence that could potentially break the case wide open: Justin's DNA results and a complete view of all Jessica's text messages. In the meantime, Garcia went back over her interviews from Nick's work to see if she had overlooked anything. Then Garcia's phone rang, and it was Nick's brother on the other line. Garcia had spoken to him once before, soon after Nick's death, but he said this call had nothing to do with that first interview. Nick's brother said he had just talked to one of Nick's friends, and this friend was pretty sure he had important information about this case. Garcia took down the friend's details, thanked Nick's brother, and then called Nick's friend. The guy was at work, so Garcia told him not to go anywhere. She would head right over. Not long after the call, Garcia made her way through Tucson and arrived at a metal fabrication shop that Nick's friend managed. Garcia went inside. The place was loud, and several men were wearing these huge welder's helmets and were hard at work on different projects, but Garcia found Nick's friend waiting for her already at the front desk. He told Garcia that after the initial shock and grief of Nick's death had subsided a bit, he started thinking about anybody who might have wanted to hurt his friend. And then he remembered something he thought could be big. Months earlier, somebody who knew Nick well had come into the shop asking for a few specific pieces of equipment. Nick's friend said that even at the time, he thought the order was a little strange, because he could really only think of one thing those pieces of equipment could be used for. Garcia asked him what he meant, and Nick's friend said, well, the equipment could be used to repair a firearm suppressor or silencer. Garcia's face lit up. She asked Nick's friend, please tell me you have a record of that purchase. And he said he did, and he had actually already pulled the information for her. Nick's friend handed Garcia the receipt with the list of items and the buyer's information. And when Garcia saw the buyer's name, she immediately felt a rush. She thanked Nick's friend and hustled out to her car. Garcia had spent only a week on her first case as a lead homicide detective, and already she was sure she had just solved the crime. Based on that receipt from the metal fabrication shop, multiple interviews, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nick in the early morning hours of July 18th, 2016. At around 4 a.m. that morning, the killer parked their car a few houses down from Nick's. They knew the neighborhood would be dark and quiet that time of morning. They also knew the perfect place to stage their attack. The killer got out of their car and walked quickly down the street towards Nick's house. They wore all black clothes and a pair of gloves. On one hip, the killer had a .45 caliber handgun with a suppressor attached, and on the other hip was a folded pocket knife inside of a leather sheath. The killer avoided the glow of a few streetlights and then walked around Nick's house to the backyard. The killer hopped the low fence and scanned the yard. They saw a ladder leaned up against the wall where they knew Nick kept it. The killer moved across the yard quickly and quietly. They grabbed the ladder and placed it against the house near the back porch and climbed up onto that kind of small roof, that awning where you could easily see into Nick's bedroom. And so once up on that roof, the killer got in position kind of right outside of Nick's window. They knelt down, and from their spot, they could clearly see Nick in his bed. And so the killer took the gun off their hip, they took a slow breath, they raised their gun, and they fired. The glass in the window shattered, and the bullet struck Nick as he lay in bed. But the gun, because of the silencer, made virtually no noise, and so nobody in the neighborhood heard any of this happening. But the killer didn't waste any time. They took a few steps forward and reached through the now shattered window. They unlocked the window, opened it up, and began to climb through it. The killer heard the sound of a dog barking inside the room, and they felt a piece of broken glass cut into their arm as they climbed through. The pain stung, but they couldn't worry about that now. The killer landed on Nick's bedroom floor, and they saw glass from the window all around them. Nick's dog barked and ran around the room, but it did not attack the killer. The killer looked over at Nick, who was lying in bed, and the killer could see Nick was not moving. But the killer didn't want to take any chances, and so as they walked across the room towards Nick's bed, the killer raised their silenced pistol and fired multiple shots into Nick's body. And then finally, when the killer was standing right over Nick, they aimed their gun right at Nick's forehead and shot him one more time, execution style. And so at this point, there was no question Nick was deceased. But the killer felt that sting from the cut on their arm, and they glanced back to see there was a trail of blood dripping behind them. And so the killer started to panic, and the dog kept on barking, which really stressed the killer out. And so the killer slipped their silenced pistol back into their waistband, and then looked around the dark room, and then headed towards the bathroom door. They stepped inside the bathroom, turned on the light, and then stuck their arm under the sink and began to wash off their cut. But when the killer turned to leave, they saw there was blood still on the bathroom floor from their cut. So, kind of impulsively, the killer grabbed a bottle of mouthwash from the counter and just poured it all over the floor and rubbed their shirt sleeves all over it, attempting to clean up the blood with it. But it was not working, and the dog just kept on barking over and over and over again. So the killer just rushed back into the bedroom, grabbed the dog by the collar, and ran downstairs and put it out in the backyard. The killer closed the back door, turned, and headed back towards the kitchen. There, they opened up the cabinet under the sink and grabbed cleaning products, a hand towel, and a bucket. They filled the bucket with water and carried all their supplies upstairs to the bedroom. Once there, they turned on the light, and they saw there was all this blood spatter on the carpet. Now, the killer knew a lot of that blood was Nick's, but for sure, some of it had to be the killer's blood. So they got down on their hands and knees and sprayed one of the cleaning products on the floor, dipped the towel in the bucket of water, and started scrubbing. And each time they dipped the towel in the bucket, they would leave carpet fibers behind in the water. But no matter how hard they scrubbed, the blood just was not coming out of this carpet, and it was taking way too much time trying to clean it. So they dropped the cleaning supplies, they took out their pocket knife off their hip, and they cut this big bloody piece of carpet away and carried it and the cleaning supplies out of the room, and they headed downstairs. But by this point, the killer was well aware that things had really not gone to plan, and at this point, the killer just wanted to get the heck out of the house. So they just dropped the cleaning products on the living room floor, but they held on to that towel they were using to scrub the carpet, as well as the actual chunk of carpet they cut away. Then the killer also hid the bucket of water in the garage, hoping nobody would find it. Then the killer ran back upstairs, went into Nick's bedroom, they climbed back out the window onto that roof, then he climbed down the ladder and then lowered the ladder onto the ground so it didn't look as obvious that he had used it to climb to the second floor, and then he climbed over the exterior fence around the property, leaving behind Smokey the dog in the backyard, and the killer just ran the rest of the way back to their car. The killer would then speed home, change out of their clothes, and put a big old bandage on their arm, and then drive into work at Mrballen Aerospace Solutions. James Lapon, the man who had filed that HR complaint, had murdered Nick. But James's reasoning behind the murder went much deeper than just some run-ins the two men had at work. It would turn out James was having an affair with Jessica, one of Nick's ex-girlfriends. And apparently, Jessica still talked all the time about Nick, and it totally drove James crazy, so he killed Nick. Garcia had first discovered this relationship between James and Jessica when Jessica had handed over her phone. They had seen the text messages between them. And soon after that, James had actually admitted to the affair as well. But he still at the time said he had nothing to do with Nick's murder. But investigators dove deeper into Jessica's text messages, and they found several exchanges between her and James that seemed really strange. In one of those messages, James implied he was going to, quote, handle his problems with Nick. In another, James asked what kind of dog Nick had, and Jessica told him it was a pit bull. Then, investigators found maybe the strangest message on Jessica's phone, Nick telling her to delete all of their text conversations. Soon after receiving those text messages, Detective Garcia received the DNA test results of her other major suspect, Justin Skinner. And Justin's samples did not match samples found at the murder scene. So Garcia definitely saw James as her primary suspect. After all, he even had this mysterious cut on his arm. Then Nick's friend at the metal fabrication shop had handed over the receipt from the customer who had bought equipment to potentially repair a firearms suppressor, and Detective Garcia saw James's name on that receipt. And so at that point, she was certain he was the murderer. Garcia got a warrant to search James's house, and when investigators did the search, they would find boxes of bullets inside of his house that had the same unique marking as the bullet casings found at the murder scene, the 5 stars on the casing head. And so at that point, police would arrest James for Nick's murder. Some investigators thought that Jessica could have been involved in her ex-boyfriend's murder, but she was ultimately never charged with anything connected to the crime. At James's trial, one of the most important testimonies came from his own wife. During the investigation, she had corroborated James's alibi. But when James was in prison awaiting trial, his wife had watched this movie in which an abused wife stands up to her abusive husband. And apparently when she saw this, it really spoke to her, and so it made her decide she had to tell the truth. James's wife admitted that she had lied to police. She said James was violent and abusive, and she was scared he would hurt her and her kids if she didn't do what he said. She told the jury she knew James had murdered Nick, and when he came home from killing Nick, he had told her exactly what to say to police. In the end, the jury found James guilty of first-degree murder, and James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When 23-year-old Juri Kibuishi walked into a room, you couldn't help but notice her. Just 5 foot 3 inches tall, beautiful and outgoing, Juri, whose Americanized name was Julie, had a freewheeling personality and instinctive kindness that just drew people to her. From the flowers that she often pinned in her dark hair to her dramatic eyeliner and colorful painted fingernails, Julie looked like what she was, creative and unconventional. Despite their much more proper and low-key appearance, Julie's Japanese-born parents had always encouraged their daughter's artistic pursuits. And when Julie, a lifelong resident of Irvine, California, was high school-aged, she was accepted into the prestigious Orange County School for the Arts. This was a highly selective charter school that catered to students who were especially interested in the visual and performing arts. But Julie's parents had also stressed the importance to all 4 of their children of getting excellent grades. So even as Julie spent 5 years studying dance and becoming a gifted and passionate performer, she also applied herself with just as much energy to her college preparatory courses. Julie's goal after high school was to dance, and to eventually get a degree in fashion design. She found just the program she wanted at Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa, California, one of the top transfer community colleges in the country, and just a 30-minute drive from Irvine, California, where Julie lived with her parents. At Orange Coast, Julie could get her associate's degree and start work in fashion right away, and then if she wanted to, she could transfer to a 4-year college. She would also have time to take dance classes and keep performing. Located 37 miles south of Los Angeles, Costa Mesa is a busy commercial city about a mile from the Pacific coast. Not nearly as expensive as Los Angeles, Costa Mesa was a magnet for aspiring actors and artists and writers who hoped to make their way into some aspect of show business, whether it was movies, the stage, dancing, or scriptwriting. Julie loved the creative energy at Orange Coast, and she also loved all the different types of people who are drawn to a community college, from older students with day jobs to younger students like herself. One of these students was 26-year-old Samuel Herr, an Army veteran whose military service included 15 months in a remote and dangerous outpost in Afghanistan. 5 foot 10 inches tall and 200 pounds, Sam had movie star good looks and an outgoing personality. An only child of older parents, Sam's father had served in the Marines, and like his father, Sam had also found purpose, meaning, and self-discipline during his time in the military. Sam's fellow soldiers described him as courageous and funny. The women he served with described him as very professional and chivalrous. In 2010, after his Army enlistment ended, Sam had also enrolled in Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa. This was the first step in his plan to earn the college degree that he needed in order to re-enter the military as an officer. Although Julie and Sam came from very different backgrounds, as soon as they met each other in an anthropology class, they totally hit it off. Not in a romantic sense, each of them had serious long-distance relationships with other people, but as friends. Both of them were very close with their families, they enjoyed socializing, and they both had the same outgoing personalities and the same slightly goofy sense of humor and fun. They also both liked tattoos. Julie had 7 of them, and Sam had ink on both arms as well as a huge heart inscribed with Mom and Dad tattooed on his chest. But on a deeper level, Sam and Julie were also both very serious about getting good grades in college and ultimately achieving their long-term career goals. So as soon as Julie realized that her classmate Sam was struggling in their anthropology class, she offered to help tutor him. One evening, when Sam's parents stopped by their son's apartment and met Julie, who was there helping Sam with his homework, they were both struck by the easy friendship between their son and Julie. And when Julie would go on to describe Sam to her parents, she would say they were just friends. One of the nice things for both of them about being in a strictly platonic relationship was being able to talk to one another about their romantic partners. Julie was in an online relationship with a Marine corporal named Mark, who was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and Sam was engaged to a German woman named Katerina, whom he had met while he was in the service. Sam also felt comfortable opening up to Julie about his combat experience in Afghanistan and the night terrors that he had brought home with him. As their friendship grew, Julie began spending more time with Sam outside of just tutoring, and one thing they both liked to do together was spend time with the group of young people who often gathered in the evenings and on the weekends outside of the large apartment complex where Sam lived. For Sam, the Camden Martinique Apartments, which is where he lived, were the perfect location. It was less than a half mile from Orange Coast College and only a 30-minute drive from where his parents lived in Anaheim Hills. The rent wasn't cheap, but Sam had always been very careful with money, and he had saved $62,000 in combat pay that he had earned while he was serving in Afghanistan. Among the big group of young people who hung out together at the apartment's pool and outdoor patios, there was one couple in particular that Julie and Sam got to know pretty well. 26-year-old actor Daniel Wozniak and his fiancée, 23-year-old actress Rachel Buffett. Like a lot of actors, Dan and Rachel struggled to make ends meet, even as they dreamed of breaking into the Los Angeles acting scene. Rachel, who was small with delicate features and long blonde hair, still looked the part of the Disney princess she once played at Disneyland when she was a teenager. Dan, who was a big guy, had an easy smile, thick dark hair, good looks, and a booming voice that helped him land lead roles in the community theaters where he and Rachel often starred opposite one another. Usually dressed in khaki shorts or pants and Hawaiian shirts with bright prints, Dan never felt more at home or more genuinely himself than when he was on stage. In the spring of 2010, when Julie and Sam met Dan and Rachel, Rachel was busy planning the couple's wedding. After a 2-year-long engagement, the big date was finally just weeks away, May 28th, and afterward the couple would go to Mexico for their honeymoon. On Friday, May 21st, just a week before Dan and Rachel were going to get married, Julie had a date with her older brother, Taka, at a Thai restaurant in Long Beach to talk about his wedding. Taka also had a surprise for his younger sister. He and his fiancée wanted Julie to be a bridesmaid at their wedding, and that night at dinner, Taka handed Julie the tiara that she would be wearing on Taka's big day. Julie was thrilled, but she was also feeling a little distracted and worried. Throughout that afternoon and evening, Julie had started to receive a series of very strange text messages from her friend Sam. He sounded upset, and he told her he needed to talk to someone. In what she thought must be a bad attempt at humor, he wrote, "No sex. Can you come over tonight at around midnight? Just talk, don't tell anyone. Going out for a little now. Some bad family stuff." Julie was puzzled. Like her, Sam seemed to get along with his mother and father really well. In fact, she thought he was supposed to be visiting with them in Anaheim that weekend. Julie told her brother about these weird messages she was getting. Taka asked her if this was normal for Sam, and she said no, but Sam had been through a lot. Noticing her brother looking concerned, Julie looked up from her phone and smiled at him and said, "Don't worry, you'd like Sam." After dinner, Julie said goodbye to her brother, and laughing, she put the tiara on just before stepping out into the clear 60-degree evening. She could feel the light breeze from the ocean as she climbed into her car to make the 35-minute drive south from Long Beach to the Camden Martinique Apartments where Sam was. The following morning, Julie's mother, June, looked down the bedroom hallway of their house and noticed the door to her daughter's bedroom was open. Peeking inside, she saw Julie was not in there, and she realized in that moment that her daughter had not come home the night before. June immediately called and texted Julie but received no answer. When she called her son Taka to see if maybe Julie had stayed the night with him and his fiancée, June's worry deepened to alarm. Taka said no, Julie was not with them, and he told his mother about the very strange text messages that Julie had received from her friend Sam. Feeling very concerned, Taka and his mother began scrolling through their texts and contacts to see if they could find Sam's number. Meanwhile, about 20 miles away in Anaheim, Sam's parents had also begun worrying about their child. Sam was supposed to visit them that morning, but he hadn't shown up yet. Sam had always been good about letting his parents know if his plans had changed or if he was running late, but by midday, they still had not gotten a call or text from him. By late afternoon, Sam's father, Steve, who was an athletic-looking man with thick white hair who often went to the gym with his son, he hopped into his car and drove up to Costa Mesa to make sure Sam was okay. Once Steve arrived at the Camden Martinique apartments, it was getting dark. He walked up the stairs to apartment D110 and knocked on the door. When he didn't hear an answer, Steve reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare apartment key that Sam had given him. He unlocked the door and he stepped inside. Turning on the light, Steve saw immediately that there was no one in the kitchen or living room and also no sign of any disturbance. As he headed toward the bedroom, he hoped he'd find his son laid up in bed with a bad cold. Instead, as he pushed open the door to the bedroom and flipped on the wall light, it was like he had discovered a chamber of horrors. Kneeling next to the bed with her upper body lying stomach down on top of the mattress was the body of a young woman. Her jeans, which were cut or torn, had been pulled down almost to her knees. On the back of her sweater, scrawled in black magic marker, were the words, "All yours, F you." Although one side of the woman's face was visible, she was totally unrecognizable. Her features were covered in blood and gore, and all Steve could really see was just this massive wound above and behind her ear. It looked like the back of her head had been blown off. And just above that crater of bone, blood, and brain tissue, Steve saw a tiara tangled in a mass of blood-soaked hair. Shocked, Steve backed away from the gruesome scene, and after quickly checking the other rooms and finding no one else in the apartment, he pulled out his phone and he dialed 911. Near the doorway to the bedroom, police found a colorful shoulder bag. It contained a cell phone and a wallet with a driver's license. The victim, sprawled on the bed and the floor, was 23-year-old Julie Kibuishi. When they were informed by police that their daughter was dead, Julie's parents were devastated. June Hibuishi kept telling the officers they must have made a mistake. The evening before, she and her daughter had been cooking together in the kitchen. When it had been time for Julie to go see her brother at the restaurant, she had changed her clothes, given her mom a quick hug, said goodbye, and stepped out the door. It was impossible to June and her husband that this daughter, who was so kind and so full of life, could now just be dead. As for the Costa Mesa detectives who arrived on the scene moments after receiving Steve Herr's frantic 911 call, every piece of evidence they discovered inside of that apartment pointed to Steve's son, Sam. Sam knew the victim, and from the words written on the back of Julie's sweater and the position of her body that suggested sexual assault, she may have been caught up in a love triangle gone wrong, or been the victim of a domestic dispute with Sam. Most damning of all was the long string of strange text messages that Sam had sent Julie the night before, begging her to come see him immediately. And even though Sam said, quote, "no sex" in one of his text messages, just the mention of sex seemed to indicate that it was possible that these two were, in fact, romantically involved, despite what they told people. And then there was Sam's military background and his combat experience in Afghanistan, and the possibility that Sam, like many combat veterans, was affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe Sam had just snapped and killed Julie during an episode of combat-related psychosis. The cause of death appeared to be a single gunshot wound to Julie's head, and as a trained combat soldier, Sam would have known how to use a firearm. 24 hours later, when Sam still had not been located or heard from, the Costa Mesa police had found yet another reason to suspect he was their killer. After digging into Sam's background, detectives were stunned to discover that back in 2002, when Sam was 18 years old, he had been arrested and charged in connection with the murder of another teenager. Although Sam was eventually acquitted and cleared of all charges, he had been a serious suspect, and he had spent the better part of a year behind bars. The police wasted no time. They issued an all-points bulletin with Sam's picture and physical description plastered across the top of it. Meanwhile, however bad things looked for Sam, Steve Herr could not believe that his son killed Julie. Sam had been acquitted of all criminal charges related to that 2002 murder, and even after the trauma and stigma of spending months in jail, Sam had gone on to rebuild his life and reputation. He always had a steady job from that point forward, but it was when he enlisted in the army that he found his true sense of meaning and purpose. So while police launched a massive manhunt for the man they considered armed and dangerous, Sam's father started to do his own digging. If Sam was on the run, he would need money, and Steve shared a bank account with his son. Sure enough, when Steve accessed the shared account, he saw that every day since his disappearance, Sam had used his ATM card to make a series of large cash withdrawals. The trail led south to a bank of ATMs in Long Beach. The police had also tracked Sam's ATM card, and unlike Steve, they had access to the video surveillance at the ATMs. Looking at the camera footage, detectives expected to see the face of Sam Herr. Instead, the person seen using Sam's card was a teenage boy carrying a skateboard and wearing sunglasses and a hoodie. When the same ATM card was used to place a pizza order at a nearby pizza joint called Echoes, police were able to get the address of the house where the pizza would be delivered. They staked out that address, thinking that maybe Sam was hiding inside of the house, but when police, guns drawn, entered the house right alongside the pizza delivery person, the only people they found inside were the teenager they'd seen on the ATM surveillance tape and his mother. A terrified 16-year-old Wesley Freilich told police that he had been given the ATM card by a man he knew who was working for a bail bonds agent. The man had told Wesley that the card belonged to a client who had posted bond but then disappeared without paying the agent. According to Wesley, this man who had given him the ATM card was someone his mom knew through the community acting that she did. Wesley said he was a good guy and he trusted him when this guy outlined the plan with the ATM card. Wesley would make withdrawals every day of up to $400 and turn the money over to the man who would wait in his parked car some distance from each ATM machine. As payment for doing this, Wesley would be allowed to use this ATM card to order pizza for himself. The name of this mystery man was instantly familiar to police: 26-year-old actor Daniel Wozniak. Daniel and his fiancée Rachel, who were both friends with Sam and Julie, had been among the residents of the apartment complex that police had interviewed the day after Julie's body had been discovered. And in the course of that routine interview with them, Dan had told police that he and Rachel had last seen Sam on the afternoon of Friday, May 21st, which was the night Julie had dinner with her brother before going to see Sam. Daniel told police that he, Rachel, and Sam had chatted briefly that night, and then Sam had left the apartment complex with a man in a black hat who Dan did not recognize. After determining that the 16-year-old Wesley had no personal connection to Sam Herr, police decided to turn their attention back to Dan. The bail bondsman's story just sounded like a total fabrication. They now suspected that Daniel might be helping Sam get money and that Dan might even be hiding or covering for his friend. But tracking down Dan for a second interview turned out to be much more difficult than the police expected. When they finally reached Dan on his cell phone and asked him to come into the Costa Mesa police station for another interview, Dan was evasive. He wanted to help, but he was busy. It was the final week of the play 9, in which he and Rachel had starring roles. They were also just days away from getting married, and when they weren't rehearsing or on stage, they were busy with last-minute wedding plans. Frustrated, detectives decided not to wait any longer. On the evening of May 25th, just 3 days after Julie's murder, detectives crashed Dan's bachelor party. They found Dan, dressed in his trademark khaki pants and Hawaiian shirt, at a suburban Japanese restaurant named Tsunami in Huntington Beach. Guns drawn, police entered through both the front and back doors. That way, no one could get out of the restaurant without being seen. At about 10 p.m., in front of his stunned group of friends, police snapped handcuffs on Dan and charged him with accessory to murder. Dan was completely shocked, and the color in his face just completely drained. But once Dan was inside the police station, his demeanor changed. He suddenly seemed somewhat composed and told police that he wanted to tell them what his real connection to Sam Herr was. Sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the small interrogation room, Dan took a deep breath and then came clean. He told police that the whole bail bondsman thing that the 16-year-old kid was involved in was indeed a fabrication. It was a cover for a credit card scam that he and Sam were in on together. The way it worked was Wesley, the 16-year-old, would make a series of large cash withdrawals using Sam's bank cards, and then Sam would put in a claim with his bank saying he never authorized the withdrawals. This, of course, allowed Sam and Daniel to keep the cash Wesley had taken out, as well as the reimbursement money they would get from the bank. Wesley did not realize this was going on. He thought this was all legit, and he really was working for Daniel, who was working with a bail bondsman, and Wesley thought he was just getting some free pizza out of it. His mother was also unaware of this scam. The police proceeded to ask Daniel the same questions they had asked before when they spoke to him at the apartment, and Daniel gave the same answers. The last time he saw Sam was on that Friday afternoon, shortly before he saw him walk off with some guy in a black hat, and then that night, Daniel and his fiancée Rachel had been at their theater performing in their musical called 9. But then something odd happened. About 30 minutes into this interrogation, Daniel suddenly completely changed his story. The police were so caught off guard that they really didn't even interrupt. They just let him speak. One minute, Daniel was talking about this credit card fraud scam, and then the next minute, without missing a beat, Dan told detectives that, well, in fact, Friday afternoon had not been the last time he had seen Sam. In his new version of events, Dan told police that in the very early hours of Saturday, May 22nd, Sam had knocked on the door of Dan and Rachel's apartment. When Dan got out of bed and walked through his darkened living room and opened the door, he saw his friend standing in the doorway looking totally frantic and disheveled. Sam immediately told Dan that something horrible had just happened and that the two of them were in trouble and they needed to get the F out of there as soon as possible. Dan, who thought this must have something to do with their credit card scam, immediately stepped back into his apartment and, being careful not to wake up Rachel, put on his clothes. A few minutes later, he and Sam were driving Sam's car south to the Long Beach Town Center Mall where Sam had asked to be dropped off. And it was during that drive that Daniel heard exactly what the horrible thing was that had just happened. And it had nothing to do with a credit card scam. Sam went on to tell Dan that Julie was in his apartment and that he had killed her. Dan told police Sam's exact words. "I shot somebody. It was a fit of rage. I was doing some heavy drugs. I'm not happy about it, but she had it coming." The two detectives looked at each other. This was exactly the break in the case that they had been hoping for. Daniel's story had just confirmed their own reconstruction of the crime. Now they hoped that Dan could help them locate their killer, Sam. According to Dan, he had no idea where Sam was or where he was going, and that before they parted ways, before Sam got out at that mall, he had threatened Dan and told him that if he went to police and ratted him out, that Sam would come back and kill him, or he'd come back and he would kill his fiancée Rachel. And so when police had questioned Dan and Rachel the day after the murder had been discovered, Dan had panicked and lied to police in order to protect himself and his fiancée. He told police there was no man in a black hat, that he had made that up. At this point in the interrogation, Daniel was a wreck, and he just repeatedly apologized to police for misleading them. But despite Dan's sincerity, the police were now concerned that he might be hiding even more information about Sam, and so they decided to apply some pressure. At 11:43 p.m., about 1 hour into this interrogation, police asked Dan if he would give them permission to take a DNA swab. That way they could confirm that Dan was never present at the actual crime scene. Right away, Dan agreed. At this point, he was extremely eager to do anything he could to remove himself from the suspect list. As soon as the detective finished taking the swab out of Dan's mouth, the video camera inside of the interrogation room captures Dan's very obvious sense of relief. It was clear as he started to check his pockets and put his cup of coffee down on the floor that Dan thought this whole thing was over. The interview was over, he had done the swab, and now he could leave. But just seconds later, as the detective who had taken the DNA swab peeled off his gloves, the other detective asked Dan where exactly in Sam's apartment were police investigators likely to find Dan's DNA. Since Dan was a regular visitor in Sam's apartment, if they were going to use his DNA to rule him out as a suspect, they needed to know what Dan had already touched. And this question seemed to startle Dan. The camera footage showed him running his hands through his thick black hair, and for the first time, Dan looks kind of nervous, but he does tell police that they are likely to find his DNA in both the bathroom and perhaps out on the patio. Those are the two places he would go inside of Sam's apartment. After Dan says this, one of the detectives asks Dan point blank, "Did you see Julie's body inside of Sam's apartment?" Dan practically shouted that he had not, that all he knew about the murder was what Sam had told him in the car on the way to the mall that night. But the detectives, noticing that Daniel was really starting to fall apart and act nervous, they decided to ramp up the pressure by bluffing. Leaning forward towards Dan, who was now leaning back in his chair, one of the detectives asked Dan, "So, if you claim you were only in Sam's bathroom and patio, then why did we find your DNA inside of Sam's bedroom near Julie's body?" Now, keep in mind, they had no way of knowing if his DNA was inside of that apartment. They wouldn't have known for weeks. But Dan didn't know that. He thinks what they're telling him is factual. And as soon as they said this to him, Daniel changed his story again. Looking totally defeated, Dan slumped down in his chair and he said, Okay, I'll tell you. This is what really happened. According to Dan, when Sam arrived at his apartment in the early morning hours of Saturday, May 22nd, and told Dan they needed to get the F out of there, before they got in the car and drove away, Sam had told Daniel what he had done and then took Daniel up to his apartment and actually showed him Julie's body. At this point in the interview, the cameras showed Dan back on his feet, pacing across the small windowless room. He's agitated and he's running his fingers through his hair. And for the next 3 hours, the two detectives pressed for more details about exactly what Dan had seen in Sam's bedroom. By 2 a.m. on Thursday, May 27th, Dan had been talking, yelling, and sometimes whispering to police for 4 straight hours. He was exhausted, and since he was getting married in now less than 48 hours, he was desperate to just wrap this up so he could go. So at 2:17 a.m., Daniel, who had been caught completely between a rock and a hard place, between trying to protect his friend or telling the cops everything he knew, seemed to crack. "Yes," he finally shouted at detectives. "Yes, I saw her goddamn body. Is that what you want to hear? I saw 2 gunshots in her head." Both detectives suddenly went completely still and looked at each other. They also looked up at the camera that was recording the interview and playing it live in an adjoining room where a third detective was watching it. All 3 detectives were thinking the exact same thing. Dan Wozniak had just given them a critical new piece of information. Based on what would stretch into a 14-hour interrogation of Daniel Wozniak and an investigation into the new evidence police would uncover based on what he told them, this is the reconstruction of what happened to 23-year-old Julie Kibuishi and how police were finally able to locate their prime suspect, Sam Her. Back on the evening of Friday, May 21st, about half an hour after Julie had left that Thai restaurant in Newport Beach where she was having dinner with her older brother Taka, Julie pulled into the parking lot next to the Camden Martinique apartments where she had agreed to meet her friend Sam Her. Although she was still wearing the sparkly tiara that her brother had just given her, Julie's mood had turned serious. Before heading into Sam's apartment, she scrolled one more time through the dozens of text messages he had sent her starting that afternoon. They all seemed so strange and out of character for Sam, but she knew Sam dealt with some very serious night terrors from his time in Afghanistan, and for all she knew, he could be having some sort of breakdown right now that was Afghanistan related. So, believing Sam really just needed a friend right now, she put her phone away, got out of her car, and made her way over to the stairs that would take her up to his apartment. When she reached the floor his apartment was on, she saw Daniel standing outside of it. It turned out Dan had become worried about Sam too when Sam had not been responding to his knocks on his door. Dan told Julie he did have a spare key and thought, maybe the two of them should just go inside and see what was going on. Grateful for the company, Julie waited a minute after Dan had unlocked the door and walked inside. Then she followed Dan into the apartment. There was no sign of Sam, but a few seconds later, Julie, who was standing in the front area of the apartment, she heard a terrified-sounding Dan call out from Sam's bedroom in the back of the apartment. She asked what was going on, and Dan just called out, "You'd better come in here. There's something in his bed that you need to see." And so Julie began walking towards the bedroom. Several hours earlier, Daniel had called Sam and asked him to go with him to one of the small community theaters where Dan often performed. It was called the Liberty Theater and was located about 30 minutes north of their apartment complex. Daniel needed help moving a heavy piece of set furniture that was wanted by another local community theater. Sam agreed, and the two met outside in the parking lot of their apartment building. Then they hopped into Sam's car and they headed north. Once they arrived, Dan led Sam through the empty theater, and when they were backstage, they climbed a flight of stairs to the second floor, and then once they were up there, Dan pointed out a dusty wooden ladder that led up to the attic. So up they went, and as soon as they were up there, Dan quickly walked over to this big piece of furniture and signaled to Sam that that was it. That was the piece they were going to move. Sam nodded and moved past Daniel and took up a spot next to him, kind of crouching down to get a good grip underneath this big piece of furniture. Little did Sam know that his friend, Daniel, who was now standing behind him, could not have cared less about moving furniture. Instead, Dan was quietly pulling out a .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol. And then once it was out, he aimed the pistol carefully at the back of Sam's head, and then he pulled the trigger. For a moment, all Dan could hear was the echo of the shot reverberating around the attic. And then Sam, who was still alive, turned to look up at his friend. Sam whispered, "I need help. I need help. Something hit me. I think I've been electrocuted." Looking directly into Sam Herr's eyes, Dan raised the pistol and pulled the trigger a second time. Except the weapon didn't fire. It jammed. So while Sam is laying there staring up at Daniel with a look of horror on his face, Daniel calmly pulled the slide back of the pistol. He cleared the jammed round out of the gun. He reloaded the gun and then placed the gun up against Sam's temple and pulled the trigger again. This time, the gun did fire, and this time Sam would die. Then Dan, stepping carefully to avoid the blood that was spreading out across the floor, bent over Sam's body and removed his phone, and rifling through his friend's wallet, Dan pulled out Sam's passport and Sam's ATM and credit cards. Flipping Sam's phone open, Dan began to send what would be a long string of text messages to Julie. Each one was carefully scripted to draw her to Sam's apartment later that night and to look to an outsider as though Sam was in the midst of a personal crisis and that he and Julie were somehow romantically involved. Leaving Sam's body where it had fallen, Dan climbed back down the wooden ladder, down the flight of stairs to the ground level, left the empty theater, and got into Sam's car. But before going back to his apartment, Dan picked up the 16-year-old Wesley Freilich, and they made their first withdrawal using Sam's ATM card. Once he had returned to the Camden Martinique apartments, Dan had just enough time to shower, change his clothes, and send Julie yet another round of strange text messages from Sam's phone. "I need to talk to you. Can you come here around midnight? Please, come alone, please." A little while later, when Dan arrived at the Hungry Artists Theater for the final showing of the play he was in called 9, this was not the same theater where hours earlier he had killed Sam, his fellow actors would report that Dan showed no sign of any stage jitters. Instead, he gave what some of his colleagues described as the best performance of his life, playing opposite his beautiful bride-to-be, Rachel Buffett. After the performance, Dan stood for a moment backstage by himself and checked Sam's phone. Once he saw that Julie had agreed to meet Sam at midnight, Dan smiled. Then he stepped back into the group of friends who were all congratulating him on his great performance. Then he and Rachel headed home, where Dan would shower yet again. He would have sex with Rachel, and then he would tell her he was stepping outside just to go for a little walk. In reality, he was making his way over to Sam's apartment to wait for Julie. At midnight, Julie arrived, and then when they both went inside and Dan went into the back bedroom and called out for Julie, Dan did, in fact, have something he wanted Julie to look at in the bed, but not because there was anything for her to actually see. Once Julie had walked into the bedroom and put her bag down and stood in front of the bed, not seeing anything on it, Daniel reached around her and pointed at the center of the bed and told her she needed to look closer to see what he was talking about. And so confused, Julie leaned forward, looking at the center of the bed where there was nothing, and as she did that, Dan pulled out the same pistol he'd used to kill Sam earlier in the day, and he aimed it at Julie, and he fired 2 shots into Julie's head, hitting her just below the tiara that was now tangled in her blood-soaked hair. Moving quickly, Dan arranged the scene as he would any other stage set. Using scissors he had brought with him, Dan cut through the waistband of Julie's jeans, pulling them down around her hips to make it look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he took a black magic marker and wrote, "All yours, F.U." on the back of her sweater. Satisfied that he had created the perfect frame job that would have police chasing down Sam Herr as Julie's murderer, and knowing police would never find Sam, Dan backed away from Julie's mangled and bleeding body and returned to his own apartment, where he showered yet again. The next day, Dan returned to the Liberty Theater where he had killed Sam. This time, he brought an axe and that same pair of scissors with him. Returning to the attic, Dan used the scissors to cut off Sam's clothes, and he used the axe to dismember Sam's body. Dan left Sam's naked and headless body upstairs in the theater, but using plastic bags he had picked up at a nearby cafe, Dan packed up Sam's head and hands and one arm and stuffed them into a backpack. Then, Dan left the theater, drove to the El Dorado Nature Center 3 miles away, and there he scattered Sam's remains in shallow openings he found or dug near the bases of trees and under bushes. Then, Dan, who was so far behind on his rent he would soon be evicted from the Camden Martinique apartments, and who desperately needed money to pay for his upcoming honeymoon, headed for the ATMs where he would meet Wesley Freilich and collect another $400 installment of Sam Herr's combat pay. It is possible that Daniel might have gotten away with the brutal murders of Sam and Julie, but in those early morning hours of May 27th in the Costa Mesa police station, at about 2 a.m., when Dan was asked by detectives what specifically he had seen when he looked at Julie's body sprawled out on Sam's bed, Daniel Wozniak delivered exactly the wrong line. "I saw 2 gunshots in her head." All 3 of the police officers who were listening to that interview knew that anyone who was just looking at Julie's body, like Dan claimed he was doing, they would only have been able to tell there was a single wound. It would not have looked like 2 distinct gunshot wounds. So the only way Daniel could have known that there were 2 gunshots in Julie's head was if he had fired those shots himself. So when he still kept denying any involvement, the police told Dan they knew he was lying and they put him into a jail cell. They reminded him he was under arrest for being an accessory to murder, and the only way he'd be leaving is when he told them everything he really knew about Julie's murder. And then the following afternoon, at about 1:15 p.m., Dan would further implicate himself during a conversation he had from the jail with his fiancée Rachel Buffett. By then, Rachel knew Dan had been arrested. She had also found out from Dan's brother, Tim, that Dan had given Tim a backpack filled with bloody clothes and a .38 caliber pistol, Sam's passport, phone, wallet, and 2 spent shell casings. Instead of destroying the bag as Dan had told him to, Tim had just thrown the backpack over the fence behind their parents' house. When Rachel told Dan on the phone in a call that was recorded by police that she was going to tell the detectives what she knew, including the existence of this backpack, Dan whispered into the receiver, "Then I'm doomed." 30 minutes after this phone call with Rachel, Daniel would signal to police that he was ready to confess to what he did. The cameras show him sitting at a small table in the interrogation room, elbows on the table, head resting in his hands. Yes, he had murdered Sam because he wanted that $62,000 in combat pay that Sam had saved from his deployment to Afghanistan. And yes, he had murdered Julie just as a decoy, a way to mislead police into thinking that Sam had disappeared because Sam was not a war hero, but rather a killer who had gone on the run after murdering Julie in a fit of rage or jealousy. When asked by police why he did it, Daniel told them, "I'm crazy. It was always all about the money." Following Dan's confession, police searched the Liberty Theater and found Sam's badly decomposed partial remains. The only way to recognize the torso as belonging to Sam was the heart tattooed on his chest that was inscribed with the words Mom and Dad. On May 29th, the day Sam Herr would have turned 27 years old, police found his head, hands, and one of his arms scattered throughout El Dorado Nature Center. More than 5 years later, on December 16, 2015, Daniel Wozniak was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At the penalty hearing in September 2016, Daniel was sentenced to death. 3 years later, a separate jury found Dan Wozniak's ex-fiancée Rachel Buffett to be an accessory after the fact, after further investigation revealed that she had lied to police to cover up her possible involvement in the crime and to protect her then-fiancé Daniel Wozniak. As for the families of the victims, June Kibuishi wonders if she had taught her children, especially Julie, to be too kind. And for Steve Herr, the thought of his son's final moments will haunt him for the rest of his life. Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the 5-star review button's home and turn the batteries in every remote in the wrong direction. Also, please subscribe to the Mrballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have